Welcome, everyone, to our brand new podcast called Getting Deep with a PhD and a JD.
Hey, Nikki.
Hey, Kimmy. Guess what? I have a question for you.
Oh, I'm surprised.
All right, so let's pretend that you are going out to eat, because I know you love to go out to eat. I love to go out to eat too. What is the appropriate amount for a tip? So if you get really good service, what is the appropriate amount?
Well, I have always thought that the appropriate amount when you get really good service is 20%. But I'm finding that is more of the sort of minimum standard now. And that standard may be a little bit more, but 20% stands out to me.
Yeah, 20% has always stood out to me as well. But just like you said, in doing some research, I'm finding that now, post-pandemic, it seems like that amount has gone up to as much as 30%.
Yes.
And so we are going to be talking about tipping today. And in thinking about this episode and doing some research, I was really surprised because I always thought that tipping was an American tradition, and that because if you think about it, like we always say that we equate working hard, like the harder you work, the more you're going to get rewarded. And that's kind of that's written within our American ideals. However, I found out that tipping is not an American institution. Tipping was really something that we adopted from the European feudal system. And so it is something that that evolved, and tipping has really become very, very, quote, American now. But at first, it was not seen as being American. In fact, at first, there were lots of people who were anti-tipping, who did not support incorporating tipping into society.
Yeah, and one of the articles that I read that talked about some of the folks that sort of spearheaded the anti-tipping movement in the early 1900s. One of them was the daughter of J.P. Morgan, and she went so far as opening a restaurant back then, where the whole purpose was there was an anti-tipping policy. And in connection with with this resource discussing, the history of tipping here in the States, one of the quotes was, from one of the folks during that time was that, hey, we fought hard against this aristocracy and this idea of superior and an inferior. So why are we bringing this to the United States? But no, why? What you want to tell the people? Shockingly, why?
Racism and oppression. Yeah. So when we look at the history of tipping evolved after the abolishment of slavery. So after slavery, you had lots of formerly enslaved folks who were unemployed, who needed employment. And you also had a white community who was not really used to being on the same level as formerly enslaved Blacks. And so tipping was a way to get Black folks to work in restaurants. So you're giving jobs, but the white owners of the restaurant could say, okay, I'm not paying them a fair wage, or I'm not paying them anything at all. And they could just work for tips. And so as a result, it became, this is a way to fulfill the requirements of giving people jobs, but it's also a way to say, oh, I don't have to pay them.
Right.
And
It's an
so,
extension of
yeah,
slavery.
it's an
Like,
extension of slavery. And so really, and this extends to today as well, because when we look at who gets tipped, we see that that we have a disproportionate amount of the tips going to people who aren't of color. In other words, people who identify as white tend to get higher tips than people who identify as Latino or Black or Asian. And so it really does become an oppressive system that's rooted in racism.
yes.
Yeah.
Gender
And
inequality as
gender
well.
inequalities as well. And
Because we,
also, and
Mhm.
also um, thinking about how people look, because more attractive people tend to get higher tips as well.
Yeah. And it's so when you bring that point up, I want to put a pin in that appearance when we start to talk about the atmosphere of tipping now.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things with the history of tipping is a lot of states in the early 1900s, we call that period what, Reconstruction, right?
Reconstruction, yeah.
Yeah, so in the early 1900s, a lot of states did implement anti-tipping laws.
Yeah,
Like, it was illegal to, include tipping in restaurants.
right,
However, by about 1926, the federal government repealed
right,
all of those laws because it was hard to enforce and all of that. And then they see the benefit of employing, Black people in those roles without having to pay.
right.
So, so when we so we can kind of start talking about the timeline, right, of tipping in connection with minimum wage, right?
Yeah,
So, FDR's New Deal was when we first saw the idea of a minimum
minimum
wage in
wage.
38.
Yes, and
And
25 cents an hour.
oh, was it?
That's what it was. It
Wow.
was 25 cents an hour. That was the very first minimum wage law. It was
Okay.
part of that New Deal.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
And that New Deal left out restaurant
Restaurant
workers.
workers. Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah,
starting then they were left out. And then we also talk about the rail cars, right? Were left out. However, the rail cars, the workers there unionized and formed one of the first Black unions,
unions. Yeah,
and they fought against that exclusion, and they won. In a sense, in that they were required to be paid minimum wage plus tips on top of that. And I think you have some context to add to that, and then I'll
yeah.
get back to the
The
timeline.
the Pullman porters. The Pullman porters. On one hand, when Pullman started the company, he was it was very discriminatory, because what he wanted to do is he wanted to give average everyday people an experience that made them feel like they were superior. So he wanted everyday average people to feel like upper class citizens. And so how did he do this? By getting these porters who could provide anything that the writers needed. For example, they would make up their beds, they would provide drinks, they would entertain children, they would shine shoes, they would carry luggage, they would do all of these things. And they were a mere bell ring away.
Hmm.
And who did he hire for this? He only hired Black Southern men. And he also quoted, someone said, well, why do you only hire Black Southern men? And he even acknowledged that due to slavery, that Black Southern men were already acclimated, and they
Mm,
were accustomed to being subservient, and
mm,
they knew how
mm,
to please people.
mm,
And so
mm,
that's why he hired only Black men,
mm,
Black Southern men.
mhm, mhm.
And so and the other thing was, tipping was seen, going back to tipping, tipping was seen as for people to be able to tip, it was considered almost a sign of their wealth and a sign. It was almost like an honor, a sign of honor, a badge of honor, being able to tip someone. And accepting the tip is people who accepted the tip also acknowledged that they were subservient.
Inferior, yeah, and
Right,
subservient.
and inferior. So when we're looking at the anti-tipping movement, it's interesting because white supremacists or white nationalists, I don't know if they called them white nationalists back then, but
Probably
people
not.
who had
Mm-hmm.
those views were some of them were anti-tipping because they said that they found it unconscionable that a white man would tip another white man because
Right.
that would demean the white race, and that would also
Mm-hmm.
show that that white man was not valuable, because the only person who should receive a tip would be a subservient person. And
Right.
that's why they identified Black men as being
Mm-hmm.
the ones who could legitimately gather tips.
And then also, when we were talking about this, the Black men were successful in unionizing because the idea of white customers having this aristocratic experience
Yes.
outweighed the idea of the Pullman workers being included in the minimum wage. So that kind of helped boost their ability to do that, to unionize, and then to be included in in that group of folks that's protected by federal law and in the federal minimum wage.
Yeah.
So,
And isn't it, oh, sorry to interrupt, but isn't it interesting that that's still wrapped up into racism? But because of racism, there was this need to have these Pullman porters, and they were so valuable. And it was because they were subservient, because they had only Southern Black men, that that legislation was able to move through, because they were seen as being so valuable because of racism. I mean, it's like
right. It's like
tied in. Yeah,
it's like a weird vicious cycle.
it is. And I'll also tell you that I did watch a documentary about the Pullman porters, and one of the things that there was like a grandson of one of them, and there was actually one that was still alive who was very, very, very old. But what he said and what his grandson said was that it also provided, the Pullman porters provided an opportunity for folks to go out and see the world, because traveling through rail cart, they were able to just go and see different places and see different accents. And the grandson said, as a result of hearing all these stories, he was inspired to go and graduate from college. And I think he was either a doctor or a lawyer. I couldn't remember. But so he was able to do that. But it was only because he heard all of these stories, and he had a lot of questions because of hearing these stories from his grandfather. And so,
Wow. Yeah.
isn't it? I thought that was really
making
interesting.
lemonade out of lemons, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if we get back to this timeline, so we've got the New Deal in the 1930s, late 1930s, and then we've got the first minimum wage overhaul in 1966, right?
Yeah.
And so once again, restaurant workers were left
out,
and the emergence of this sub minimum wage,
yes,
which is
yes, tell us about that.
The sub minimum wage is $2.13, a whopping 2013 cents. And to this day, restaurant workers are excluded from the minimum wage requirement by the Department of Labor and the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? So there has been a push to overhaul the minimum wage once again. And that push started in 2017. And this is just a fact, the Republican Congress voted against increasing the minimum wage, number one, and then including restaurant workers in the minimum wage requirement. So you've got that sub minimum wage. And so I want to kind of add I want to add a little bit of sort of editorialism to this picture. I want to sort of paint a picture of what this, really means. And I read this New York Times op-ed by Michelle Alexander. She wrote this op-ed in 2021. Because once again, it was put forth in Congress, and I think in 2019, and it was voted, Republican Congress voted against it. And then it was brought up again, I think, in 2021, something like that. And so she was just providing an anecdote on her own experience working in a restaurant. And, she had come of age where, yeah, tipping was what it was. She said she felt a sense of pride when she would get a good tip.
Good tip, yeah.
But then when she didn't get a good tip, she was sort of in a privileged situation because she was living with her parents. So if she didn't get a good tip, she would just be like, "Oh, okay, well, maybe I'll work harder,
Next
or maybe I'll
time,
do something different, or what." But she remembers seeing her coworkers crying at the end of the day because they didn't make enough tips to feed or to pay the babysitter. That was
Right.
the memory she had.
Right.
And so that, to me, that just really brings life to the situation. And you're not just looking at it as numbers and those folks over there. It brings the humanity in it. I mean, when you see a coworker literally crying because they can't pay their bills, basic necessities, after working 10-hour shift, maybe, who knows, and working hard, and so
they're in the hole.
yeah,
That doesn't make sense for them to pay a babysitter and they can't make enough to cover the
to
cost
pay
of the
the
babysitter.
babysitter.
And they're working the entire time.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so this culture has created a whole subset of food and housing insecure people, meaning people who can't afford food and can't afford to, their housing. And so that's the picture that we're looking at when we talk about how minimum wage and restaurant workers need to be included in the minimum wage to prevent that from happening.
Right.
And this is the other anecdote, right? So she also said that one day when she was working, it was a table of, and this is in the article, of rowdy white men, and they left and didn't leave a tip or anything. And so her coworker, a white woman, came up to her and said, "Listen here, dear, just give the rednecks to me. I'll handle them." And so they had a system where when it was clear that that's what was happening, they would kind of like wink at each other, and the white waitress would handle the table with the rednecks at the table. Because this woman who wrote the op-ed, she's a Black woman, and they just wouldn't pay her because, more than likely, because she was Black.
So let's take a second and really think about what that means. Because really what that means is that, first of all, as a restaurant worker, she was not making the minimum wage. And, by virtue of that, she wasn't making a living wage. And the customers were expected to subsidize the employer's costs.
Yes.
So,
that's what it is.
We already know that Black and brown people their tips tend to be less than people who identify as white.
The white counterparts.
Okay? Yeah. So when we really think about it, tipping can really be like this really oppressive situation that reinforces racial and gender stereotypes,
biases. Yeah.
Biases. It's this system that's just there, and it just reinforces them. Because the article that I read, they looked at studies, and they said, okay, if it's true that the reason we support tipping is because by having tipping, you're going to get better service, right? What they found was that wasn't true. And so the article was great. They went through their methodology and they explained how they did it. And what they found out was that people who looked a certain way and did certain things tended to get higher tips, regardless of the amount of time spent at the table or the amount of time engaging with the customer.
Yeah.
And so it was just really interesting. And they also moved it to Uber. So they took the restaurant industry and they said, okay, well, what if tipping isn't required? What if it isn't required? Well, and it's not required in the restaurant, but if we really think about it, it is required, because if you don't tip, then that employee is not is not going to be able to eat or pay their bills because they're getting paid such a small amount of money per hour.
Because let me interject this real quick. Because now, though, the way the current federal law stands, you have what's called the tip credit.
Yes.
So employers are supposed to make up the difference. So
Right.
if you don't get the amount of tips to bring you up to what the minimum wage is for that state, your employer is supposed to make up the difference.
Make up the difference, yes.
But studies have found that a lot of them aren't doing that. A lot of them are just blatantly in violation of wage and hour law.
Yes.
Right?
And who knows about tip credits? If you walked out on the street, would you, and you said, hey, do you know what the tip credit is?
Right.
Do people even know what that is?
I didn't know that it was codified. Like I didn't know
I didn't know
it was a law,
either.
right?
Yeah.
That they had to do that. And so of course most people don't know what resources they can seek out to enforce it. You know, a lot of times they don't have the time because they're trying to pay their light bill and get food on the table. They don't have time to call the Department of Labor, because that's who you would call. The Department of Labor, their wage and hour division, and file a complaint. People don't have time to deal with that. And so a lot of the employers kind of get away with not making up the difference.
Yeah. I mean, I worked in a restaurant environment. I didn't work there for very long because there are a lot of other issues going on, but I didn't work there for very long. But when I worked there, I didn't know anything about any tip credit. You know, I just got certain tips and I went home and I looked at, how much I was supposed to make per hour. And then I figured out how much by hourly, I didn't know anything about it. But I also want to get back to the Uber part.
I'm sorry. Yes.
So, no, you're good. I think it's really important that you mentioned tip credit because a lot of people don't know about it. And this podcast is about uncovering those pieces of knowledge that people aren't aware of to let people know about. So they wanted to understand, would people tip if they didn't really have to tip? And so with Uber, you don't have to tip. The whole process is you can tip afterwards. And so that's after you've gotten out of your ride. And so it's not like you say you're going to tip beforehand and then the person might, if you're going to tip well, they might, drive really nicely, or if you're not going to tip well, they're like, driving like a maniac. And what they found is a very small percentage of people actually tip on Uber, which I was very surprised about. The other part that they said is that the people tip a lot of times when they're in the evenings or at night. They also tip people who are white men tend to tip really well. And so if you're looking at just that piece of information, right, it might say, oh, white men tend to tip well for Uber. But if you think about the other pieces that could be contributing to that, so during the time that they looked at, they had a higher percentage of white men. They also could see where they were going, and they were going to places like restaurants from like airports or going to hotels. And so they figured out that these people were probably there on business. And what do we know about business? Lots of folks get an expense account. So the people who tended to tip were also probably not using their own money to tip.
Their own money,
And so people were clearly getting good service because they were going from point A to point B and they weren't making complaints, right? But people were not tipping. So we can't necessarily say that if you get good service or if you get mediocre service, you're going to tip.
Right. And it's interesting that you bring up Uber and that sharing community, because I was actually just having this conversation, and it was this video that had kind of gone viral. I guess it went viral, and it was a guy who was driving for not Uber Eats, but DoorDash maybe.
DoorDash, okay.
May have been DoorDash. It was a food delivery service.
Oh, okay.
And he was upset with the customer who hadn't given him a tip. And so he actually confronted the customer. And so
oh, wow.
we got into a conversation about that. And as a result of the conversation, I did some research and I found that the the companies like Uber and DoorDash, they actually pay their drivers. They don't pay their drivers in the same way that restaurant workers are paid, like at the sub minimum wage. They pay them the minimum wage.
Right.
And so I didn't realize that either. And so the tipping in that industry is a little bit different because
Yes.
they, those companies are paying the drivers more than the sub minimum
Right.
wage. So they're not in the same boat.
Exactly, because with the restaurants, you are tipping to supplement that person's salary. So it really isn't. So if you really think about it, it's really not a tip because you got excellent service. Because if it happened to be a tip for excellent service, then you would assume that people would be getting paid at least the minimum wage, and this would be above and beyond that.
Yeah.
But it's not. It is just to get them up to perhaps the minimum wage.
You mean the restaurant workers?
The restaurant workers, yes.
Yeah.
But with Uber,
Uber,
they're getting paid the minimum wage. So any tips that they get would be because of that's over and beyond.
Exactly.
So it's a very different situation. And this brings up the question of why is it that restaurant workers are so different from other places where we have other people getting the minimum wage who are in the service industry, whereas restaurant workers, what is it about them? And if we think historically,
right?
Remember when we talked about historically, we had a lot of formerly enslaved folks, and what could they do? They could go into restaurants because, in slavery, a lot of them knew how to cook and knew how to prepare foods. And so that was a skill that they could do. And so you had a disproportionate number going into restaurants.
Yep.
And so the restaurant industry, really started from a point of having folks who were formerly enslaved.
Yeah. So they were basically they were the main ones that were working in that field.
Yeah.
So I think that this can kind of, because we can talk about
we could talk about this. We could say so many things about this, right?
So let's move into what our call to action would be for this topic. And I would want to start with pointing folks who are affected by this, whether directly or you just feel like it's not right, that restaurant workers are still making that wild and crazy sub minimum wage. And one of the resources that I found was a website called raisetheminimumwage.com.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of good information on the website. You can look up your own state to see what your own state's laws are. You can then cross-reference and find out what your senator and your representative, how they voted when this law has been presented to Congress, several times, and how they voted.
Right.
That will tell you what's important to that particular representative or senator. And it also includes information on the different campaigns associated with raising the minimum wage. And if you want to get into the weeds, it provides a lot of information on how many citizens in your state would benefit and how they would benefit from raising the minimum wage, how the country overall would benefit from raising the minimum wage. So that would be my call to action, is to take a look at that website. There's a lot of good information there.
I think that's a great call to action. And I also want to add to that, because I think that when we talk about raising the minimum wage, I know that there are lots of people out there that have arguments against it. My call to action is go to the scholarly literature and look at the actual studies. There are some great studies that have been done about what does it look like when you raise the minimum wage. Also look at tipping studies in tipping. Who tends to tip? Because what we really have to acknowledge is that if we stay on a system that's based on tipping, then we enshrine racism, sexism, ableism. We enshrine we continue to enshrine all of that because people don't get paid the tips based on their gender, based on their age, even. You know, young, attractive, white women who are servers tend to get more money than people who are not those characteristics. And so, you know, so in other words, we really have to understand, we have to have some actual studies to show us this information. And so lots of people will say, oh, I feel this way and I feel that way. That's great. But what do the studies say?
Yeah, what are the facts, ma'am?
What are the facts? Just the facts. What are the facts?
And just the facts, yeah.
Yeah, what are the facts? And there's some great studies out there. In looking at this, I was actually going through and I was able to see some really great studies that have been done. And also looking at the Department of Labor, you know, like looking at the history and looking at data that they collect, I think is also really important.
And if you are a part of the restaurant industry, and you know you feel that you know you're not getting the wages that you're supposed to, check out the Department of Labor. I mean, that's the agency that enforces all of the wage and hour laws on the federal level. That agency enforces the federal laws associated with minimum wage and tip credits and all of those things. That's a resource for you. And they offer a channel through which you can file a complaint, and and then they kind of take you through the process to determine if you do have a valid complaint. This is not legal advice, but this is certainly a resource that you can check into that may be of assistance if you're in that situation. So that will be another call to action too, if you're directly affected.
Yeah. And I also want to say another thing too, people who own restaurants or own multiple restaurants, to please consider what continuing to fight against the minimum wage for your workers is really doing, and how providing the minimum wage could really give you a better quality of worker. It would give you people who really could feel more connected to their job. And because it's something, when you don't have your basic needs met, you're operating in a different level, on a different level.
Scarcity. You're operating
from a scarcity perspective. Like we talked last time about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, we're operating, trying to get those basic needs met. So it's the restaurant industry that is very much opposed to raising the minimum wage. And so they're very much into tipping. And just consider that you are asking workers to have people that they don't know subsidize their employment. And that is not their job.
Yeah.
Their job should be employees should be hardworking. Employers should pay a decent and fair wage.
Yeah.
And if you support tips, they should get tips above and beyond the basic minimum salary that they're supposed to be getting. And so
you should at the very least meet the minimum legal requirements.
Yeah.
And the tip credit. If they're not earning their wage as they should, you're supposed to, from my understanding, making up the difference.
Right.
So.
Right.
So that leads us to our final segment, and I don't think we've done the song in a couple of episodes.
We have not. I was just thinking about that. Our
consistent listeners know what we're talking about.
They know.
Tell me something good segment. So, are we gonna sing the song?
We're gonna sing it. We are gonna do it. Okay, ready?
Yeah. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Tell me something good. Oh God, it never gets better.
I know, but we still try, right? We're still trying, and one day it will get better.
A for effort.
A for effort.
Yeah. So my So the tell me something good that I found was the one fair wage, which was surprising to me. I didn't know that this was a thing. So basically, there are 7 states who have enacted state law increasing, not only increasing their own minimum wage, but including restaurant workers in that minimum wage requirement, basically.
Yeah.
And it's 7 states: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Minnesota, and Alaska. And you can see that on that website that I mentioned, the Raise the Minimum Wage website. You can see, those states included in that with that. So that's really good. Like I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, I didn't either. I didn't either.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's definitely something good. And I think another thing that's good is that we're starting to see a lot of the younger generation talking about the younger generation again. We're starting to see the younger generation talk more about the minimum wage and really thinking about tipping from a very different perspective. And people are really starting to ask questions, and so I think that's encouraging. I think that we're seeing, especially after the pandemic. I don't know if you've noticed, Kimmy, but I just sense, and I see more writing about worker satisfaction.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
More worker satisfaction. I think that that it was moving towards that way even before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic really exacerbated and really made people really think about their work and what it means and what they're getting paid and how they're being compensated. And so I do think that it's caused people to really think more about the idea of a minimum wage. And we also hear more about a living wage.
Yeah.
And it's also made people think about tipping and the history. But because when I looked in the, just doing the search for tipping, I saw just a lot of articles, a lot of information that seemed to be dated within like the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I was not aware of the connection between tipping and the abolishment of slavery. I was not aware of that. But now it seems like it's, in particular, like younger people that is just a piece of knowledge that they just have because of the information that's come up with, like I said, within the past 5 years. So I think that's something good, is that people are becoming more educated about these situations, and hopefully that will improve the work environment, but also we'll start really thinking about the minimum wage and restaurant workers and the importance of that.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a show.
I think so too.
Yeah. So until next time, as usual, make sure you comment,
like and subscribe.
And
yes,
comment. We really do want to know. Let us know what your thoughts are. And if you have any ideas or anything you want to learn more about through our help with this podcast, let us know. We want to hear.
Yeah, definitely let us know. We love comments and we love our listeners. And so please leave a comment and make sure you like and subscribe. We really want to see our subscribers. Like, we want to see our numbers. We want to see more folks hearing what we have to talk about and interacting with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Absolutely. Well, bye for now.
Oh, I like that little wave that you did.
Bye.
Kimmy just got her nails done, so she had to do the nice little wave. Bye, everyone.
Bye.